Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast, raising awareness and inspiring action for personal and planetary health, with your hosts, Ben and Emma.
Hello everybody, and my name is Ben Adelberg.
And I'm Emma Strutt.
And welcome to episode 29. And gosh, what a couple of weeks it's been with the release of Working Group 1 IPCC report. There's been a lot of discussions online, and we've certainly been a part of it. But as we discussed just 2 episodes ago with Dr. Sally Gillespie, we do need to be aware of how to manage all this.
Yeah, so remember, if you are feeling a bit down or stressed at the moment, do check out episode 27 with Sally Gillespie. She covered beautifully some strategies for tackling eco-anxiety and climate grief.
So we really seem to be timing these particular discussions quite appropriately. And with today's chat, we're certainly going to be taking a deeper dive into our brains, so to speak. Now, I've just finished reading The Better Brain late last night, which ironically is probably not good for my brain, going to bed so late. Plenty of good stuff in there. So, Emma, let's bring in the wonderful author.
Okay, so Dr. Julia Rucklidge is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch. Julia's research interests are centred on the role of nutrition in the expression and treatment of mental illness, from ADHD right through to stress following natural disasters. Julia has over 130 peer-reviewed publications. Her 2014 TEDx talk has now been viewed over 1.8 million times, almost 1.9. And in 2018, she was named one of the top 100 most influential women in New Zealand. Julia has also recently published her new book, as Ben just beautifully plugged. So we're in for a treat today, folks. Professor Rucklidge, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Emma and Ben, for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Julia, just like with all guests, as we always do, let's start off with a little bit about yourself. Tell us, you're not Kiwi of origin, so there's obviously a little bit of a journey there. Tell us a little bit about what interested you into, the whole concept of nutrition, the brain, and why you ended up in New Zealand.
Sure. Yes. Well, it's a big story, and I'll try to keep it brief. So I originate from Toronto in Ontario, and I grew up there, and then I moved to. I did my first degree in neurobiology, neuroscience at McGill, and then I went to the University of Calgary to do my master's and PhD under the supervision of Bonnie Kaplan, who I co-wrote the book with. And at that time, I did some research on ADHD, but nothing to do with nutrition. So I had, in fact, my training is not in nutrition. I'm a psychologist, and I was also taught that nutrition was pretty much irrelevant to brain health, and so we didn't really need to worry about it as long as we always say, as long as people are eating a healthy diet, then they'll be fine, and you don't need to worry about having to supplement or even change their diet. But nowadays I think, well, what's the understanding of what a healthy diet is? And you can spend a lot of hours and hours thinking about that one. So, but when I was doing my PhD, Bonnie was approached by some families in southern Alberta, Canada, who were using nutrients in not at that point in a pill form, but they were using nutrients more in a liquid form, particularly minerals, to help treat the psychosis and bipolar disorder in family members, and then people in their small community, because they came from a place called Raymond, and it's a tiny rural town just outside of Lethbridge. So they came, and Bonnie was like, well, she'd studied nutrition and earlier, and had despaired, and then so she said, well, this is snake oil, and take that away from me, in a sort of probably in a very lovely kind of way, because she's a lovely person. But they persisted, and they sent her data in a form that was interpretable, and as best as they could. They weren't scientists, but they monitored people's symptoms and showed people getting well. So she decided to run a small clinical trial. And as I said, I was just finishing my PhD. I was like, what in the world is she up to with all these minerals and these unusual potions. But I followed what she did and followed her research, and she published in really good journals in the earlier part of the century, showing people getting well and staying well, and people who had serious mental health issues like bipolar disorder. And not only did they get well, they were able to get well with a lower dose of medication. So everybody should be happy about the reporting of those types of studies. So I was intrigued, but I wasn't my area of expertise. And I, at that stage, I moved to New Zealand in 2000. I accepted a job at the University of Canterbury to teach child and family psychology on the clinical psychology program. And I'm still doing this 21 years later. I'm still doing that. But Bonnie came to New Zealand in 2003 and she shared these data. And there were some other people, some other psychiatrists who had also been looking at this same idea. And I was intrigued because by then I'd lost my naive, young student ideas that we can cure the world with medication and or psychotherapy. We certainly do well for some people, but in all honesty, if we're completely look at the data, how well people are doing, not enough people are getting well. And I think we're recognizing that. Probably not enough, to be honest. I don't think we still think that we can just, if we just had more counselors, and that's certainly what's happening in New Zealand at the moment. Just, if we could just train more psychologists and more health professionals to treat people with mental health issues, then we'll solve this problem. I'm not convinced. I don't think that that's going to do it. I think it's the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It's waiting for people to get unwell and then seeing whether or not we can help them by talking to them and or medicating, and medication has only gone so far. Some people get well, but if you look at the long-term outcome data, you have a lot of people out there, and whenever I do talks to large audiences, I ask how many people here know of somebody who's taking a medication, and how many and then usually it's a whole audience, and then how many people are recovered, and then you have very few, and you think if a medication was so good, I should have everybody putting their hand up. If you were to say, how many people have had a broken leg, and you'd have, hands up, and then how many people still have that broken leg, you wouldn't, because it's been, addressed medically with treatment. So that's really the eye-opening um, realization I had back in the earlier, maybe 2004, 2005, was that we're just not helping enough people. So here's this idea that comes along. Yeah, it certainly doesn't fit with my way of thinking and my training specifically, but uh, it's as scientists as we are as academics, we're the critic and conscience of society, and I really hold that dear, that we have to question things, and we need to question conventional treatments. We have to constantly be doing that, otherwise we don't progress and we stagnate. And that's what I did. I decided to run clinical trials. I didn't think it would work, but I figured, well, then people want to know that these magic potions don't work. Somebody needs to test it. And what I found, lo and behold, was that in fact, many people have done well. Not everybody, but many, many people have done well with this intervention. And so it's then led me to thinking about our food, but I'm sure we'll come to that. Sorry, there you go. Long answer, but
No, that was brilliant. But before we get too far into the weeds of, nutrition and mental health and the link between the two, let's just set the scene very briefly. So there is an increasing number of people identified with a mental health problem, both in New Zealand and Australia. Can we just very quickly kind of talk about some key stats around mental illness locally to you, so in New Zealand? So what are the kind of numbers we're looking at?
Well, it always depends on how you measure it. So it's not the simplest answer, and but based on the data, if you look at it sort of collectively, the number that's thrown out there is 1 in 5. If you looked at North America, they would probably say 1 in 4. But to break that down into the different disorders, kind of misses it, because one person can have several disorders just because of the way the diagnostic system works. And so we just need to be mindful of that. But I think a 1 in 5 number is probably a fairly accurate picture, is that 20% of us are struggling with a mental health issue in any one given year. And that goes up to about 50% if you're looking at lifetime.
The in terms of well, it's in New Zealand at the moment. It's getting a lot of prominent publicity. The whole state of mental illness, and
It
you
is.
know, just very recently, there's been the very sad passing away of an Olympian track cyclist,
Mm-hmm.
and the statistics, you mentioned this in the book as well, that it seems to have gotten worse over time. Is that because we're capturing data better, so there's actually more of an issue, or or was it simply more suppressed and people are more comfortable saying that, hey, there's an issue? Why what could be the contributing factors to why the figures have gotten worse over the years or over the
Mm.
decades and so on?
Yeah, Ben. I don't know if anyone can give you a good answer to this one, and because a lot of people will say it's got to do with more people stepping forward. We're pushing it a lot more. I think people are starting to just pathologize normal life. I worry about that. Is that anxiety is normal. Like a certain amount of anxiety is normal. It tells us that there's something to be concerned about, or for us to fear, because it might be something that is going to harm us in some way. So we do need a certain level of anxiety, but then there's a point where it becomes harmful to us because it's no longer serving its purpose. And that's when it would be very useful to get treatment. So how many people are going out there who are, who think, oh, this, I do experience some anxiety, but then we are pathologizing it to a certain extent, as well as sadness. Sadness is a normal part of life. As somebody who's recently lost somebody and going through grief, that I don't want that pathologized. That is part of our human experience. But we are definitely seeing more and more children who are struggling with their emotions and anxiety to a extent that probably is really concerning. And that I can't help to wonder how much of the things that are happening in our environment are contributing to that. Obviously, the food environment I think is really important, but other environmental issues like this, in terms of, you mentioned at the beginning of the program, climate change. That is a huge worry. And how much is that affecting our young people? Because that's something that's imminent in their lifetime. And that's not something that most of us have had to grapple with in our lifetime. Like when I was a kid, that wasn't something, that the end of the world is coming, or that we're going to be facing so much, uh, you know, a change in our climate that we might be forced to move or flee or experience famine. That certainly wasn't in my existence when I was young. So sorry, I always find it really hard to answer that question around, is it going up or are we becoming more aware? And it's probably it could very well be a bit of both.
Yeah. And I mean, it's obvious that we've got this issue now, and hopefully our listeners will already know, kind of what you're about to say, because you've hinted at it in your beautiful intro. But can we medicate our way out of this, or should we be turning more to lifestyle measures like nutrition?
Yeah. I really don't think we can medicate our way out of this. I think that's ended up being too simplistic a way of thinking about mental health issues. Mental health issues are so complicated. To think that we can give one molecule to change that experience has turned out to be not as good as we hoped. And reflecting back on my neurobiology degree in the late 1980s, when we were thinking about the cause of mental health issues as being caused by these neurotransmitters that were out of whack, and it was a really alluring idea and intriguing and exciting time to be learning about neuroscience, about how if you just manipulated these levels of dopamine or serotonin, then you could have an effect on people's experiences of, say, hallucinations, or say of depression, or of attention problems. It was so exciting. But unfortunately, after 40 years of using these medications, we've learned that they only go so far. And they are simply a band-aid to the problem. But the more worrying thing is that coming off of them is being proven to be a huge challenge. So many people are taking these medications, still feel depressed, and yet when they try to come off of them, they experience an increase in, say, anxiety. It's often been described as being the underlying problem is just unleashing itself again. But now what we're being a little bit more aware of is that in fact it's probably, maybe that's a little bit of what's happening, but more likely is that they're experiencing withdrawal from that, having their brain having adapted to this chemical being present, and then you take it away and you experience withdrawal, similar to how you'd experience withdrawal from nicotine or from heroin. You can also experience withdrawal from these medications. And so that's a concern. So I don't think that a solution to the problem is to medicate our way out of it, because we're creating a new problem.
So why the continued reliance on prescribing medication? Is it
No.
is it just a simple solution? Here, I'll just write a prescription, off you go. Is it the education system? The fact that nutrition is not adequately taught, and in fact, like you've mentioned earlier, and you've said in the book, it's been said that it's of trivial significance. It's
Yeah.
don't worry about it. It's not going to
Yeah.
do anything. Or is it purely greed? Is it just a profit making mechanism for those big entities? I mean, let's cut to the chase here.
Right. Well, Ben, I think you've covered it all right there. Is that I think there's definitely a part of it. I mean, general practitioners, psychiatrists want to do the best for their patients, and we do need to acknowledge that. They're not evil. They are, when they prescribe, they are genuinely thinking they are doing something that's going to be good and helpful for their patients, or I would hope they wouldn't do it. That's the bottom line, is that they should not do it if they think that that's going to cause harm. That's their hope, their oath, their what is it, the Hippocratic oath is to not do harm, right? So we need to start there and assume that these health practitioners are doing the best for their patients. But they are a product of their education, and their education taught them that psychopharmacology is the best way forward in terms of addressing these really serious problems. And so they're going to obviously be led by their education, just like I've been led by my education in psychology. So that's going to influence, whether or not I think that psychotherapy is going to be helpful or not. So we carry around this unconscious bias in terms of how we look at the world, and then appreciating, as you said, nutrition is just not taught in medical school. It is not taught to psychologists. It was not part of my curriculum. Then you're going to dismiss it because you're going to think, well, if it was so important, then it should have been taught to me. And and then combine that with the last thing that you mentioned, which was greed, which is that the pharmaceutical industry gains from people getting prescriptions. That's their business. And so they're going to do everything that they can to ensure that people are going to be tried on their product, and they've got a good captured audience in that they play a big role in the education of our physicians.
And I mean, we've got this massive kind of consumption of these pharmaceutical products now, but just thinking about the food and mood link, our food system's radically transformed in the last 100 years as well, hasn't
Yeah,
it?
it sure has.
And our brain is so like nutrient and glucose hungry. Can you talk to us a little bit about the
Sure.
situation we find ourselves in now with this?
Yes, and I bet you guys know it. So I'm guessing, but I'll say it anyway from my perspective. So I mean, and your listeners, I assume, will also know this, is that we've undergone one of the most radical experiments in human history in terms of the change in our diet, and it's been over a very short period of time. And really, the biggest problem has been the introduction of ultra processed foods. And I would say that probably dates back to just after World War II. We've had a certain amount of processing that's happened. Obviously, some processing would be deemed as being a great invention, like, for example, um, freezing your vegetables. Or canning your vegetables can preserve the nutrients in a good form for a longer period of time, so that we can eat them at another time when perhaps that's not in season, for example. So there's certain amount of processing that is deemed to be absolutely fine. Cooking would be viewed as a to form a form of processing. But ultra processed food is where you remove a lot of the really good things from the food and then you add a whole bunch of other things back in order to make it taste good. And I think all of the listeners will be familiar with it. 69% of the food that is sold in supermarkets in New Zealand would be deemed as ultra processed. And so we're surrounded by it, by these foods. And we've been led to believe that they are part of a good diet. And that is when I go back to, if you just eat a good diet, these foods would be viewed as part of a good diet, like the cereals that are ultra processed that everybody, so many of our population are consuming every day.
But they're fortified with vitamins and minerals.
So they are
okay.
fortified.
The All Blacks eat it. The Ironman athletes eat it.
They do. And I would say, well, how many nutrients are they fortified with? We need about 30. There are about 30 essential vitamins and minerals, plus or minus. And we need all of those. They're all viewed as essential, which means that they're needed for good health, and we cannot make them. There's a few that we can make. There's some B vitamins that we can make, that our bacteria can make in our microbiome, and there's vitamin D that of course we can make from the sun. But outside of that, we have to consume them from our food, either from, the minerals are in our soil. The minerals are taken up by the plants. The plants then use those minerals to make the vitamins. So you either eat the plants in order to get those vitamins and minerals, or you eat an animal that's eaten those plants. That's sort of your basic way of getting those nutrients into you. So where was I going? I feel like I've lost track of where we were going with that.
Sorry, we
remind
interrupted
me.
with our sarcastic comments.
So, yes, I've completely
Basically
lost
the
it.
reliance on processed foods and the definition around that. And you really
Yes.
do touch on that. And for the listeners, you do, and you really revealed some things I didn't know about the definition of process. So get into the book, and there's a really fascinating chapter on that. But
Yes.
that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, so just you were asking me what the change in the diet and over a very short period of time. So we're eating foods that at the end of the day are very low in vitamins and minerals. And mentioned fortification. And so fortification of, say, a cereal could be about maybe at most 6 or 7 nutrients might be fortified. They might add some iron in, they'll add a few of those B vitamins in. Maybe they'll put some vitamin, I don't know, D or E in there, maybe a few minerals, but that's it. You certainly won't get it fortified with, say, molybdenum, and that's an essential nutrient. I've never seen that on a cereal package. So you'll get some of them, and so that means that maybe the population will be okay in a few of those essential nutrients. But for the most part, when we look at a population level, how are we doing with hitting even a recommended dietary allowance, which I'm not a super fan of, but it's sort of a minimum amount that you should be consuming. We're not even hitting that when we look at consuming these types of foods. So we have a long way to go in order to change the nutritional intake of our population. We really need to focus on that before we focus on, I think, a lot of other things.
And I mean, the system's not really set up at the moment to kind of optimize food for nutrient density, is it? I mean, it's because things look pretty, or they transport well, or they grow easily.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And so that's that. And that's, again, I always like to be kind to why things happen. And I'm sure that's probably the wrong way to see the world, because that's not always the case. But we have not, I don't know, 8 to 9 million mouths 8 to 9 billion mouths to feed. And so in order to accomplish that, you can see that you're going to be having a lot of shortcuts on growing food. And so you're going to want food to grow quickly in order to be able to produce the food that we need for the world. So that I see as being part of the challenge, is that we have so many people on the planet. And then that means you end up growing food more quickly, and that means it's less time for the plant to take the minerals out of the soil. And so then you have a less nutrient dense food, or we use pesticides on the plants, and then that can influence the nutrient density either by chelating it directly from the plant, or having an influence on the microbiome and the minerals in the soil, and directly once they're used as, a glyphosate can be used as a desiccant, and then it rains, and then you end up with the glyphosate in the soil, and then that could chelate attach itself to some of the minerals in the soil and then decrease the mineral content of the soil. And in the book, we talk about that as being a real problem in uh, uh, Canadian pastures and places where they're fields, sorry, Canadian fields. So it is a huge challenge is the food production, and we need to really to get to the root of the problem is to look at what's going on and what's going wrong, and can that be better managed, and can farmers become better stewards of the soil, and so can we address it that way.
So, as important as making decisions on what we select to purchase and eat, it's also actually going a little bit deeper and actually understanding where the food is sourced from, how it was grown, and that just adds a whole lot of complexity to which, well, how do we know? And that's
Exactly.
what makes it quite challenging, isn't it?
I know, and this is, I mean, my journey in all of this started with just supplementing with vitamins and minerals. That's what my research was on, and I knew very little about food. I had that same level of education about food, just eat a good, I have horror stories of things that I ate as a child, and and thought that was good food, and that I was given. But then I grew up at a time when women were going out to work, and so my mother was working, and so you make shortcuts, and so I tried to be so kind to why that happened, that I had such a crappy diet as a kid. So these there's a lot of other social issues that are happening at the same time, so it's not just a simple well, parents got lazy or whatever. I mean, things changed. So, but I am now far more engaged in better understanding the where our food comes from. And so now I talked a lot more to food growers in New Zealand, and I'm now talking a lot more to chefs and just people who are involved in a lot more food production, so that I can understand the entirety and the complexity of the problem, and just better understand why it is that when we gave kids and adults back in mid 2000, 2006, 2007, why did we have such a good effect giving them vitamins and minerals? It's because they're not getting it out of their food.
Yeah. Now, I think a fair few of our listeners in Australia might be familiar with the Smiles trial and the Food and Mood Centre at
Yep.
Deakin, being Aussie-led. That's received a lot of airtime over here. And of
course it
course,
has.
in New Zealand, we've got your fascinating research. So hopefully this isn't a completely new concept to our listeners. But nutritional psychiatry, it is still an emerging field. So what does it actually mean? Like eating better specifically for our brain. Is there an ideal diet? What should we be doing?
Sure. So the Smiles trial put on the map that the Mediterranean diet seems to be probably is a really good way forward in terms of helping direct people around what kind of dietary pattern to follow. And that was, though, came on the basis of epidemiological studies that were showing that the Mediterranean diet seemed to be associated with better mental health. And that then there were studies that followed people over time who either ate a Mediterranean style diet or ate a more Western style diet, which is your diet in low in fruit and vegetables, high in sugary drinks and takeaways, etc. So, and found that over time, if you were following a Mediterranean style diet, you had a lower risk of developing mental health issues versus those people who are following this more Western style diet that increased their risk of having a mental health issue. So all of those studies that were done, not just in Australia, but were done in Europe or in Japan, were all kind of saying the same thing. And so that led the Deakin group, led by Felice Jacka, to conduct the Smiles trial, which was where they manipulated diet and got people to consume the Mediterranean style diet. They gave them dietary advice, and those people were more likely to go in remission in their depression compared to people who had been randomized to a social support group and didn't get any dietary advice. That was then replicated twice so far, as I'm aware. So it's quite robust concept that if you can help people switch over away from ultra processed food towards a more real food diet, then that can have a positive outcome on their mental health. So that's really, really exciting. But then, I wouldn't say it's a new concept, and we talk about this idea of nutritional psychiatry as being an emerging idea. I mean, we've known for a long time, our ancestors knew how important diet was for our brain health. They didn't necessarily say it that way, but they, in one of the books that was used in the pioneering times, identified that insanity was caused by imperfect nutrition. So, that's good insight. And that was back in the 1800s. So, not a new idea. So, and Hippocrates knew it too. So, but it's certainly coming back into life, and that's on the heels of the pharmaceutical industry having grasped our creative thought and got us thinking that the only way to treat mental health issues was with these drugs, but then that didn't work out as well as hoped, and so we're coming back to our food environment, which is really great. So I hope I answered your question. I can't even remember what it was, but those are some random thoughts.
Now, a lot of your research, a lot of publications are centered around supplementation,
Mhm.
and you talk a lot about that in the book as well. Give us some insight into the whole concept of the use of supplementation, because there's also the fact that a lot of people use them incorrectly, maybe targeting a particular, I think I need this
Yeah,
mineral, I need this vitamin,
yeah.
when to use, it's not working, etc. Give us a little bit of an overview on the whole world of supplementation.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. If I can. It's complicated. There's a lot of money out there to be made on supplements, of course. So there's a lot of stuff on the market. I just, as a starting point, though, is that none of my research has been funded by the supplement industry. So that's been really important. Okay, so where do I start? Well, it starts with those families. It starts with those families who came up with a combination of the full array of those nutrients, those essential nutrients that we need to consume. No magic nutrient. So the concept there was different than what had been studied up until then. For the last, say, 100 years, we've had a lot of studies that have looked at nutrients in a single as one nutrient. So let's give people who are depressed magnesium and let's see what happens to their mood, or let's take kids with ADHD and just give them zinc and see what happens to their symptoms. And by and large, with a few exceptions, that has led us down a big huge dead end. And that means that, yeah, in some studies there might be a modest effect. A lot of studies are negative. They're showing no benefit over placebo effect. And overall, it's being viewed as being a no-go. There's no point in looking at supplements, and often we say it's a waste of time and it's just expensive urine, and you hear all kinds of media stories like that. But what's unique about what we've done and what others have done, so I'm not the only one, the only scientist who's done this, but is to say, but of course that those studies were flawed. They were flawed because they only would give the one nutrient, and your brain needs the full array of nutrients. And so if you just give one, you're just giving essentially one of the ingredients that the brain needs to function at its best, and you're ignoring all the rest. And so if you thought about that from a recipe point of view, it's like, wondering why, if you just put salt into a recipe, why don't you end up with pancakes? Right? And why doesn't, why, and of course you know the answer. And that's what we've done, though. As scientists, we've manipulated that one ingredient. So in retrospect, we find that that was probably the wrong way, but we had to do that. Like, we had to explore it. And there have been some exciting one nutrient interventions, like, for example, vitamin C for the treatment of scurvy. So you can see why we would keep going down that route of exploring other nutrients, but it didn't end up solving or resolving complex psychiatric problems. So the magic of what we've done is that we've taken the broad array of nutrients and we've given them all. We don't see any one of them as special. And then we've observed to see what's happened to their psychiatric symptoms. ADHD, in some cases stress, because I've been involved in a lot of post-trauma research. We're running a lot of studies right now with depression. So we're exploring the potential of giving these nutrients. And I don't think they're special to any one psychiatric problem. I think what they serve as is a metabolic tune-up. And that means that they're providing the brain with what it needs. It's topping it up. It's making sure the fuel tank is full. It's making sure that it's resilient to be able to cope with things that come along. And And that's how I think some of those symptoms are getting resolved, is that it's just providing the brain with what it needs in order to make those neurotransmitters that are so important for mood regulation, or for helping you manage your anxiety, or helping you with your concentration. So that's the research that I've been doing. And it's actually all been supplement research. I haven't done any dietary interventions to date.
And supplement is exactly what it is. It's a supplement. It's not a replacement for still making a concerted effort for eating good whole foods. Now, when it comes to the
Yeah.
supplementation, what about the balance of each vitamin and mineral? I mean, was
Yeah.
there any insight done into that? You need more of this, you need less of that, because there's the toxicity issue that if we're
Yeah.
having too much of, but it's getting the balance right. How is there
Yeah.
much
So
insight into that?
well, I think the balance issue has been known for a long time, and that isn't my area of expertise. So I'm not a supplement developer. So I've continued to mostly study those Alberta formulas from those families who came up with that concept. But there are others, it's not the magic, and there are others that have been studied around the world that probably experience, where you'd probably get a very similar benefit. And we list them all in the book to so that it's clear that we're not, to saying everyone needs to take the ones that we've studied, because there are other ones that have been researched as well. It's just there's not a lot of them that have actually been studied. The thing is about supplements is that they are regulated as foods, and so you can never put a therapeutic claim on a food. You can never say that it treats something. And so there's not a lot of benefit to a supplement manufacturer to have their supplement studied for the treatment of an illness that they can then never use that as part of their sales pitch for their product, unless they decide to have it registered as a medicine. But that is incredibly complicated, and there's no patent involved in it. If they were to do that and go through all of the cost associated with doing that, and then they do it, then everyone else can come along and they're not protected, and someone else could come up with the exact same formula. So, you see, there's a lot of problems
Mm.
in this area to try to get out there that these nutrients can be therapeutic. I can say they're therapeutic, but the people who sell them can't.
What about reliability? How do we know? Because there has been in the
Oh,
past, some brands, purport
yeah.
to have something
I
in it, but
know.
it's
I
not
know it's a
there.
problem. Yeah, it's a serious challenge. So I know that I have the confidence in the products that we've studied because we've had to essentially have them studied as medicines. We've had to go through that level of regulation. And there's been researchers in the States who have also done this, and they've gone through FDA regulation. It's not Pharmac doesn't require it here in New Zealand, but in the States they required that the product be studied and ensured that it actually has what it says it has. So I can absolutely confidently say it does have what it says it has, but you're right that that's a challenge in the industry. Now they do have there are laws to ensure that if you're selling a product, that it has what it says it has in there, and it's got to do with consumer guarantee rights and all of that. So there, hopefully, those laws ensure that people aren't selling something that doesn't have what's in there. But the only way to know for sure is to have it tested.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times now that a well-nourished body helps the brain become more resilient. And you've done some really interesting research around people that are exposed to extremely high stress situations, so natural disasters or, that tragic massacre.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research there and your
Yeah.
findings?
Yeah, so it was one of those opportunities as a scientist to explore something in an unusual situation. That's the bottom line, is that when the earthquake in September 2010 happened, and that one wasn't devastating. That one was, I mean, it was a massive earthquake, but that wasn't the one that killed a lot of people. But in that earthquake, I remembered some research that I had read about as a graduate student, where they'd studied the effects of an arthritis management program, a psychological intervention on people who struggle with arthritis. But then there was a massive earthquake in the middle of it. It was in California, and then they reported on what effect that earthquake had on their results. And I can't remember what the effect was, but I remember thinking, goodness, wow, isn't that interesting, as scientists, that you can do that. So when the earthquake happened here, I thought, well, what can I possibly do? And at the time, we had trials going using the nutrients to treat people who were struggling with ADHD. And so we had this opportunity of being able to call them up, see how they're going in their stress, anxiety, and mood symptoms, ask them questions over the phone, and then follow them for a few weeks and see how that went after that earthquake. And in that time, we were still having a lot of aftershocks. So it was that you were being constantly stressed all the way through that. And the amazing thing that we noticed was that when the people who happened to be taking micronutrients at the time of that earthquake, they recovered more quickly. It was stunning. It was like I find that probably the most exciting finding of my entire career, to be honest, is that people who are well nourished seem to be more resilient when they were faced with a really massive event, a massive stressor, and a stressor that, obviously triggered the fight flight response for an extended period of time. So that really speaks to the fact that the people who weren't taking the nutrients didn't have the same level of nourishment to help them overcome and cope with that environmental disaster. So that's why I say that a well-nourished body and brain is going to be better able to withstand that. So then so that was we would call a naturalistic experiment, but I would say my most exciting finding. It was a small sample, but really clear. After the February 2011 earthquake, we were then able to say, okay, can we help people recover even though they weren't necessarily well nourished at the time of the earthquake? Can we give them extra nutrients after that earthquake and help them? And the answer is yes. Compared to people who weren't taking nutrients, they were far more likely to recover and experience a reduction in their stress and anxiety relative to people who decided to go for treatment as usual. Their PTSD symptoms reduced from 65% down to 19% in the groups who were receiving the nutrients versus absolutely no change for those people who had gone for treatment as usual. It wasn't a perfect study. They weren't randomized to those two different groups, but we were able to look at whether or not they were fairly equivalent in terms of their demographics, et cetera, and they were. So I have, again, that sort of adds to that study that was in September 2010. Then there was a flood in Alberta, in Alberta, Canada, in a place called Little River, just outside of Calgary. But the flood also affected Calgary. In fact, my in-laws were affected, and their house was really badly damaged in that flood. So I contacted Bonnie and said, you should tell people to take nutrients because we've got all this data. It wasn't published yet, so she decided to also run a clinical trial. And then we replicated the same finding that we'd seen after the earthquake. So that, when you see replication in different environments, you can have a lot more confidence in the effect. And then you have to also remember that this is built on a very, very robust research that shows that B vitamins alone are very helpful for people who are struggling with stress. So it's not like this idea and concept came from nowhere. It was built on that idea that B vitamins are really good over placebo in helping reduce stress in different sort of environments like your workplace or at college, etc. So when the massacre happened here in Christchurch, March 15th, 2019, that was a time where I said, I am not doing any more research. This is absolutely the time to be translating research to practice. And I did everything I could in my power to try to get that message out there. I contacted the MPs, the local MPs, and the mayor, and the district health board, and anybody who had that that ability to say, we're going to give nutrients to the survivors of this a horrible, horrible event. But it was ignored. So no one took up. No one wanted to go there. They didn't want to touch it. They said there's not enough evidence. So my lab, I decided I'm not going to sit here and do nothing. So we raised money and we purchased nutrients and we gave them away. And we monitored people clinically as you would. And again, we saw the same effect. Interestingly, I mean, this is just a political plug. If there's any politicians out there, it's so frustrating to when you're a researcher and you follow the due protocol and all of our, the ways you're supposed to conduct research, and then when you have results, they're ignored. It's really, really frustrating. So my plea is that, if you're going to pay me as a scientist to collect data, when I've collected data, how about we use it? I mean, I'm funded by the taxpayer, right? For the most part, a little bit of fees from students, but overall, I'm funded by the taxpayer. So it's just crazy that's the way our world works, and I'm sure a lot of people are not aware of that. So after that, after the we collected those clinical observations, we still published it, and I then sent it back to the people who had said no, and they still said it's just observational. It's not data. It's not important. It's not relevant. It's not going to change how we currently deal with people who are facing serious trauma. So it's a sad story, but maybe it's not the end of the story. I can only be hopeful.
Maybe.
Now, I just want to read this directly from the book, although I'll truncate it, I'll shorten it, but this is fascinating. This little organ, i.e. the brain, uses 20 to 40% of the nutrients and energy you consume, and it is only about 2% of your body weight. So the key message is, even though we do need to eat properly to build a strong musculoskeletal system and a healthy cardiovascular system, when we eat, we are primarily feeding our brains. Now, like you've just said from that research paper, is that when the sympathetic nervous system is elevated, it's actually requiring more nutrients. So when you're in a state of stress or distress, which is fascinating. Are there any superfoods? Or is that a myth?
All right. Well, you guys might have a different answer to that question, given you're called the lentil revolution, so I'm not sure. I don't know. I tend to say that it's not any specific food. You need the full array of foods, and you need to eat the full array of the rainbow and different colored fruit and vegetables. And we do the Mediterranean diet that was researched by the Smalls trial did include some meat and some fish. And I would say, based on the research, that that's important to get a little bit of meat and fish for people who are struggling with mental health issues, particularly because some of the nutrients that you get out of meat and fish are easily more available in those forms. And I don't know if you guys are, you call the lentil revolution, but I don't know whether or not that
Intervention,
means...
but yeah.
Oh,
Well,
sorry.
yeah. No, we'll let you carry on, but we've actually got a leading question on that as well, for sure.
Oh, okay. Okay. So,
Yeah.
so from the research perspective, I'm just the messenger, is that the research seems to suggest a little bit of meat and definitely some fish, alongside lots of lentils, your legumes, your chickpeas, your beans, your fresh fruit, and your vegetables in season. So I would never say that there was any specific, superfood, although the nutrient content of lentils is really high. I do have to
By the
say.
way, we're not funded by the lentil industry, but if there is a lentil company that wants to sponsor us, by all means.
Get in touch.
So the leading question is, for those that do follow a whole food plant-based diet or a vegan diet,
Yeah.
we do talk a lot about the absolute necessity importance of supplementing with B12.
Yeah.
But are there any other recommendations you would make for those that don't consume meat or fish for some of those certain
Yeah.
nutrients that you recommend for brain health?
Sure. I mean, I'm always one to say that if you're really healthy and you're doing amazing and your energy is really good and your mood is stable and when stress arrives, you overcome it and you just roll with it, then I don't know if you really need any extra supplements. You're doing everything, you're probably doing a lot of things right. So, but I, of course, see the other side of it. I see the people who are really struggling, and those are the people who we see in our research. I'm not here to like optimize, say, peak performance. We're about trying to help people who are really struggling with mental health issues get out of that. And so when that happens, and I see someone who is on a whole plant-based diet, then what I would be worried about is I would be worried about their ability to get their iron. I'd be worried about their ability to sometimes get their zinc, possibly. B12 you mentioned, but the other one would be your DHA and your EPA, and that's much harder to get out of a a plant-based diet than if you were eating some fish. So the omega-3s you can definitely get out of a plant-based diet, but they're more in the form of ALA as opposed to EPA and DHA. You'd have to eat a lot of seaweed in order to try to get that the same amount of. I think I said in the book about 1.3 kilograms of seaweed to about 80
It's in the
grams
book,
of
yeah.
salmon or something. So you do need to eat a lot more to get that EPA and DHA, which has been identified as being important for mood and for ADHD. So that's my worry, is not being able to get the omega-3s in the form that is being identified as being good for mental health issues. So those would be the ones. And so that means that when you're looking at a supplement and you're still trying to buy one that is a vegan or vegetarian that has EPA and DHA in it, it's going to be really expensive from my understanding of it. And you really need to look at those labels really hard, because when you start to look at it, you need about 1 to 2 grams of EPA DHA. If you start to look at the labels, you realize that there's not a lot of EPA and DHA in a lot of the vegan sources, unless you can educate me and tell me that there is a really good label out there. But I've spent a lot of time looking at labels.
Yeah, no, the highest dose, and it's not EPA either, it's just a purely DHA supplement. The highest dose I've come across that is based on the algae oil is about 800 milligrams. So you still need to be taking multiple if you did want to reach the numbers that you're quoting there.
Yeah. And it's also that some people are missing the enzyme that can convert the ALA, because we can convert ALA to DHA and EPA, but just not very well as humans.
Okay, so you have talked a fair bit about people who are struggling with mental health issues, and for anyone that does have one, getting into the kitchen and making a healthy meal can be quite difficult. There's a bit of motivation that needs to go into that. So do you have a number one thing that you would say in terms of nutrition for improving mental health, or supplementing for improving mental health, that people could focus on firstly if they are, struggling? They won't be able to change everything all at once.
No,
is there one important thing?
Yeah. That's a great question.
Buy the book.
That's great, buy the book, because we've got lots of recipes in there, and we talk a lot about it in there. Is that we know, as a psychologist, I know that behavior change is difficult. And so for some people, it could just be changing their breakfast, or even thinking about one meal a week. Can we think about one thing? Can we do a slow reduction of, say, their addiction to, say, sodas or your soft drinks? Can that be slowly reduced and replaced by something else? So just choosing one thing will hopefully make it more achievable than if you thought, I'm going to change my whole diet, and then that becomes overwhelming and then we do nothing. But the one thing that I do worry about is that people can get into a mindset that it's going to be really expensive, and therefore I'm not going to bother. And oftentimes that's perpetuated by the health practitioners, and they would say that, oh, it's really expensive for you to eat well, so they don't even want to tell their patients or their clients to try to eat better. And I have learned that, in fact, it doesn't have to be expensive at all, and we do talk a lot about that in the book. And I also talk a lot about it in the MOOC, which is the Mass Open Online Access course that we talked about right at the beginning, Ben, which is about to start middle of August. And I got Mickey Williden in to talk specifically about how to eat cheaply, but eating well. So we gave we did a whole lesson on a whole sort of a video on talking about that. But I'd say specifically is that, if you look at, honestly, lentils, I'm in favor of lentils, especially ones that can cook really quickly, because they're so cheap and they're so nutrient dense. But also, say, beans are really easy to cook. So just maybe even, and one thing that I've been doing a lot of over the last year is doing meals where it's cheap. So not wanting to use the ingredients that are going to be really expensive, because I need to be authentic. I need to be able to say, yes, you can do it. And that's exactly how we've been eating as a family, is to try to reduce the cost. Not that's necessarily as much of an issue for us, but because I need to be completely, fully tuned into how expensive it is to eat. But some of those foods are super cheap, so easy to cook, You just have to just do a bit of Googling. Even just take two things like kale and lentils and get a recipe. It's super easy to do that on with the internet these days. So I don't know if I've done. I mean, there's a lot to it around changing your diet, but I would say step by step, just take one step at a time around
And I
doing
think
that.
the cost myth is around, if you're trying to replace something like we said right at the beginning, ultra processed food. So a pre-packaged frozen meal that contains legumes, because Professor Rucklidge said, I've got to eat my legumes, that'll be $10, $15. But if you buy the dry legumes, chickpeas, beans, lentils, split peas, and so on, that's a few dollars for a whole kg that'll last
Exactly.
multiple meals. So it's understanding that, no, stay away from those aisles. Go to the fresh
Hmm.
produce section. Go to
Yeah,
the dry bulk food stores and so on. And
exactly.
it is inexpensive. It is cheaper. And then obviously the joy that you get from creating delicious, nourishing
Hmm.
foods
Hmm.
and so on. So we've mentioned it so many times. The book, The Better Brain, which you co-authored. Tell us in a nutshell what the book's about and why people should buy it.
Well, the book is teaching, I think, people something that they probably didn't know about, and it's not being discussed in any other book, and that is why you should care about the micronutrient density of the foods that you're eating, and why we should all care as a community about the reduction of the nutrient density of the foods that we're eating. So it's really the research that I did brought me back to the basics. So I started with the research on the vitamins and minerals, and it really, like, I ended up on this journey of finding out that actually the food that we're eating is just not nourishing our brains so that it can achieve optimal function and, optimal, to optimize our life and to so that we can fulfill our lives to the full of its potential. So, food first is the message of the book, is that we really do need to be shifting away from ultra processed food. 50% of calories these days come from ultra processed food. So I think we have a lot of opportunity there to change things there. If for some people that's not enough, and I know them, I know people who have got an amazing diet, really nutrient dense, and they're still unwell, then there's a whole bunch of reasons that we talk about in the book why that might happen. And that's where additional supplements or additional nutrients could be really life saving for some people. I think that's pretty much the book. And there's a lot of
And
recipes in there.
and we've mentioned the mental health nutrition course. We'll put a link
Hmm.
to that in our show notes, but just
Yeah.
tell us briefly what that
Sure.
course is about.
Yeah. Oh, it was a lot of fun. So it's based, a lot of the information was based on the book, but I turned those into videos and so it's a 6-week course that you can take online, and there's about 5 or 6 videos per week, and they're pretty short, and then they're supplemented with other additional information if you want, but it just walks you through pretty much with the content of the book, but in a more sort of visual form. So for people who like it as a visual, are visual learners, then that might be a good option.
Now you tell me.
It's fun. I know I had a lot of fun. We were really lucky because there was no COVID, and so we were able to get into farmers markets, into the Riverside Market, and and did some filming at a beehive, and in supermarkets and walking down up and down the aisles. Yeah, I had a great time, and then it brought on some experts and stuff as well, and chatted with them.
Awesome.
So a lot of good feedback. We've had 16,000 people enroll so far, so
Wow.
it's been really well received in New Zealand and
Excellent.
overseas as well. But most of the people who are taking it are in New Zealand. So I'm hoping that it'll really change. If enough people, if you get a tipping point, enough of a mass number of people who kind of going, oh my God, this is actually kind of important. Hopefully, then you'll get somebody like Mike King stops going on about counseling as the solution to the mental health crisis, which is, fine. But I
Mm.
really wish he would, somebody would give him my book and lock him in a room until he finished reading it, if he's out there, and then see whether or not he was just focused on counseling. Because if he really is, his heart is really in the right place, he wants to change the statistics, but you're not going to do it one to one.
There we have it. All right, so I think that's a brilliant place to wrap this up. This has been a really fascinating conversation. So anyone who is listening out there, if they are, thinking that they're doing everything they can, but they're still struggling with their mental health, get the book, have a read, sign up for that course. There's a lot of really important takeaways from this conversation. So, Julia, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to keeping track of what's in store for you next with your research.
Yes, well, thanks, Emma and Ben. Absolutely fun podcast to have done.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention podcast. Make sure you subscribe and share this podcast with your friends, and visit the website for more details.